خب بنابر تلویزیون فردا یک بار دیگه خوش آمدید به برنامه تلویزیون فردا. امشب از استرالیای جنوبی، از مرکز استرالیای جنوبی، شهر ادلید. امشب خوشحال هستیم که یک مهمان دیگر با تلویزیون فردا با خود داریم و ایشان کسی نیستن بجز یکی از نویسنده های بسیار مطرح استرالیا و خصوص در قسمت های سیدنی و نیو ساوت ولز اینا زندگی میکنن. ایشان یک کتاب را جدیداً نشر کردن به نام البته در رابطه با افغانان ساربان که خب شما میدونید که تاریخ افغانان ساربان در استرالیا بسیار کهن هست و در اینجا بالاخره افغانان داشتن کاروبار میکردن در سالهای 1860 تا به سالهای 1930 35 اینا که خب امیدوار هستم ما در این رابطه شنیده باشن، اگرچه در استرالیا بسیار کم در این رابطه صحبت میشه و متاسفانه اکثریت مکاتب را که شما برین ببینین در اینجا بالاخره کسایی که از مکاتب اینجا فارغ شدن و درسای خود تمام کردن از جریان تاریخ افغان‌ها در این کشور خبر ندارن. تاریخ تقریبا 70-75 ساله از اونا. امشب با خود در برنامه تلویزیون فردا آقای رایان بات را داریم که خب ایشان جدیداً کتاب را نوشته کردن و میریم از خودشان بیشتر میشنویم که چی گفتنی دارن. ولی قبل از همه میریم با هم یک وقفه میگیریم و بعد میریم به سراغ رایان. با هم باشید. Hello Ryan, welcome to Farda TV tonight and good evening.
Hi Fahim, I'm happy to be here and thanks for having me on Farda TV.
Thank you. Ryan, please tell us about your recent project. What's going on? I mean, we see you everywhere on the news and media, especially ABC. What's going on?
Yeah, I apologize in advance. I'm everywhere if that's how it feels. I'm on the book promotion tour, so no, but it's excellent to be out there because I've just released a book about a particular Afghan Cameleer, or two probably in particular, that were living in New South Wales in the 1890s. And it's been great to get out there and as you said, see the stories in the ABC. And last weekend we had an article in the Australian Financial Review, and the headline was Australia's first logistics mogul, Afghan Cameleer Abdul Wade. And I just reflected on that. 100 years ago, Abdul Wade's name was in the business papers all the time. And, you know, part of this journey of writing this book about Abdul Wade was to resurrect his place in history. So it was lovely to see his name in the business pages again.
Exactly. When I saw that one, obviously, and it's amazing because normally it's not talked or not, just mentioned that way in Australian media, and not just media, everywhere obviously. So the people are just talking about Afghan workers came to Australia as the workers, and they were as a workers, stay as the workers, and being as sort of slaves in this country, isn't it?
Correct. One of the things I take issue with is the labeling of Afghan Cameleers as if they were all Cameleers. Now, my understanding is that the Cameleer was somebody that may have been actually working with the camel and driving the camel. Everything I've read about Abdul Wade, I'm not sure he ever actually, walked and worked with the camels. And this man was a businessman. He was an investor. He was an entrepreneur. And so I've tried to, again, tell that story of this man. And the people we refer to as the Cameleers, they're a very diverse bunch of people. And I think it's important we tell their individual stories. So, Abdul Wade was investing in copper mines. He was working in the other mines of gold mines in Western Australia. He was working with BHP in Broken Hill. He was investing in property in Sydney. So I have a line in the book where I say Abdul Wade, entrepreneur, pioneer. He was a crack shot. He was a Muslim. He was an Australian. He was an Afghan. He's a very complex character, and I think it's important we recognize that.
Very, very interesting. We're talking about all this characteristic of Abdul Wahid, and to be remember, we are talking about 1880s or 1870s, and
he arrived in 1882.
Yeah, so talking about 1882 onward, which is 1901, we have the white Australian policy, whatever, and the amount of being against this sort of characteristic was rise all the time. Is that something that he was struggling?
It affected his business, and one of the interesting parts of my research for him was that, and one thing that people have commented on since reading the book that they weren't aware of, it's not something we're taught here in Australia, that before we had the federal White Australia policy, New South Wales had a White Australia policy. And that policy was brought into the New South Wales Parliament by enemies of Abdul Wade. And it was very much a response to try to break Abdul Wade's business in New South Wales so that business, the transport business, could go back into the hands of white people. So the issue they had in trying to restrict Afghan labour in New South Wales was that the Afghan and Indian men, mainly the Indian men, were actually protected as British subjects because they came from the British Empire, even though they'd come from, today was probably modern day Pakistan. So they had rights and they were able to come in and work as other British subjects, as the white people. So they couldn't tax them like they could tax the Chinese to stop the flow. So when they brought in this New South Wales White Australia policy, the Immigration Restriction Act, it was very much designed to prevent Abdul Wade from bringing more men from modern day Pakistan, from India, from Afghanistan. It had a big effect on his business. So then he had to recruit more people, and the people he did recruit knew that he wasn't able to get any more people after 1898. And so then they obviously demanded better wages. They had Abdul over a barrel to a certain extent. So it had a huge effect on his business.
So when was the New South Wales White Australia policy?
That was brought into Parliament in 1898. And then 3 years later was the federal one. And then those New South Wales senators had a big influence on the federal policy because they'd gone through the experience in New South Wales and they knew the loopholes, which is why it was a much stronger act that came in after Federation.
So what do you think? What was a character of people like Abdul Wahid as a Afghan Cameleers or Cameleers in Australia? How they could be, impacted not just financially because they couldn't get business properly, but how about other sort of, was there any discrimination against them? Not just say finance or commercial, other like social, other stuff?
Yeah, there was a lot. And I would say there was a lot of discrimination by his enemies, by the men that he was putting out of business, by the men defending those men's interest. Because I'll also say what I've recovered in the book are the voices. He had a lot of supporters, and how we've remembered him in our modern day English speaking histories as somebody who was ridiculed. And there's stories about him losing his house in a card game. There's stories about him accidentally buying a pigskin saddle and then being told it was pigskin and giving it away. There's the stories of someone slipping a ham sandwich into his pocket. And they're the stories that have remained through history. To me, I find those stories offensive. I find them, they're trying to ridicule him, and I don't find them believable. That a man who was able to build a business empire across Australia, he wouldn't know about a pigskin saddle, that he'd lose a house in a card game. They seem to be stories that were probably put about at the time to ridicule him. What I will say, though, is that I don't think Abdul let any of that stop him. And so a couple of days after the White Australia policy was brought in at the end of 1901, I think 2 weeks later, he was naturalised as an Australian citizen. So I think he was a step ahead of everybody else. Yeah.
Excellent. When you say naturalised, can you please explain, maybe there are lots of Afghan or non-English speaking background people who are watching this program and they don't know what the naturalised mean, obviously these days?
So at that time, after Australia was in Federation, non-British subjects who hadn't come from the Empire could apply for a Naturalisation Act, and that would give you all the rights of a British subject within Australia. So Abdul had an Australian passport and he was a naturalised British subject. However, when he then travelled later on to England, it was discovered that naturalisation was only good in Australia. So even then, they try to restrict what rights you had. But he became an Australian citizen in the rights of a British subject in 1902.
Right. Ryan, tell us about your approach to this. Why you did this?
Well, it's an interesting story, Fahim. I spent a lot of time growing up in Western New South Wales, and just a couple of years ago, I came across a picture of camels in a book, and I just, what are these camels doing here? And it was a picture from the 1890s, and I started to investigate, and they said, well, there used to be a population of Afghans here.
Which book was that?
It was the historical society of a little town called Brewarrina, where my family first started out. But I'd never heard growing up. I've done 12 years of education in Australia. I've gone to university, and never once have I heard mention of Afghans and camels. When I started to read, it was fascinating. It sounded like an exciting time, and Abdul Wade was painted as this really enigmatic figure. He was, he was said to be a bit of a villain, and he was starving his employees, and he was fighting with the white people, and he was arming the Afghans with revolvers and shotguns, and it was outright war, was what they were saying at this time in Burke. And that, I was intrigued by that, and I thought it sounded really interesting. When I started to go back and research the newspapers of the day, the picture of Abdul was very different, and I quickly realized that a lot of what was written about him in the English histories was incorrect, that he was actually a highly respected businessman, highly successful, extremely charismatic person, extremely generous in his interactions with the white community. And a lot of the histories, and when I talk about histories, I'm talking about the English-speaking histories, they place the Afghan men of that time on the margins of society, and they kind of portray them as victims. And if you read the letters that Abdul was writing, if you read the letters that his cousin Ghani Khan was writing, if you think about their business partners, Abdul Wade was in business with the largest pastoral company in Australia at the time. One of his other business partners was the ex-premier of Queensland. He was a member of the Freemason Society in Queensland. He was very much an insider. He was a regular at the Randwick racecourses in Sydney, owned a waterside mansion. This man was front and centre of colonial Australia and the wool industry at that time. So I wanted to try to give him his place back where he deserves to be, because I think history's recorded him on the margins, and that's not where he lived. That's not where he lived. He was front and centre.
Two things actually you mentioned in this this answer, obviously, which fascinating to know. Obviously, number one, why the education system is not teaching in Australia? I mean, you said you were 12 years in a school, university. You never heard of it, whereas you actually still living there in Bourke, I think, where this.
So so there's some history out there now. I think in general in Australia, I started school in 85 and finished in 97. And I think very much the history that we were taught at school was Captain Cook arrived, there was nobody here, no Indigenous people, and that's history. Now here we are. I think over the last 10 years, there's a recognition in Australia that Australia wasn't built solely on the labour of white people. We're slowly coming to recognise Indigenous culture and the richness and the value and of the Indigenous culture that have been here for 60,000, 80,000 years longer. And I also think we're starting to recognise the contributions of people who came to Australia who weren't white, who weren't from Britain. There's still a long way to go. And hopefully this book creates some conversation around that. And I'm getting that feeling going out and talking to people, that people actually, the first step is to realise we don't actually know our real history. And then the second step is, so what actually did happen? I think that's coming about slowly, and people are ready to listen to these stories in Australia.
My question was more, Ryan, on why the story was not told, because I made a documentary film, and normally I hear from the people saying that why the Australian government didn't want to recognize this story and all other stories around. Obviously, what was in your research did you find that it is actually the case, and why?
Well, I don't have a definite answer why governments choose to put some things into the curriculums and not. That's a whole other thing. What I did detect in doing my research, and this is from the 1890s, there was definitely an insecurity amongst the white population. And maybe it stems from the fact that the lands they were on were stolen lands, and maybe they feared that someone would steal the lands from them in turn. But there's definitely insecurity, and I think with that insecurity comes an inability to recognize others. That maybe if we recognize the work of others, it diminishes what we've done. And I can only posit that it may come from that, Fahim, but I don't have any definite answers. What I will say, what I've sort of been talking about as I'm going around talking about this book, is surely as a country we're at a stage where we can say, yes, white people contributed to Australia. Yes, Indigenous people were here first and have this rich culture that we need to understand more, that we should be learning from. Yes, Afghan men contributed to the building of Australia. Yes, Indian men. Yes, men from the Punjab. Yes, Chinese people contributed to Australia. And I shouldn't just say men, I should say men and women, because that was one of the other issues going back through the history books, is there's almost no mention of the women. And there's some really fascinating women in this story. So Abdul Wade's cousin, Gunny Khan, his major business partner was a woman from Adelaide. He was a major investor. A lot of the Afghan men married women, but we never hear their stories.
But we hear the stories that Afghan men were not allowed to bring their women to Australia, right?
I've heard, I'm not sure if they weren't allowed, and everyone came out in different circumstances. So as I write the book, Abdul Wade came out as a 16-year-old. So I don't think he would have had a wife at that stage. Some men came out to work 3 years and go back, and they left families over there. I think reading some of the books, so I read a book, Ali Abdul versus the King by Hanifa Dean, and in her book, she writes that maybe the Afghan men didn't want to bring their women to Australia, where it was a completely different society. A lot of alcohol was being consumed in Burke. And that was the way she painted that maybe they didn't want to be mixing in those circles. So they come over here, work, and then go back. But it goes back to what I said earlier. For every man had a different story that came over here. And we need to get into. So it'd be interesting. So Gunny Khan, I don't think was married. So why? What was his story? Did he have a family back in Afghanistan that he never got to go back and see? I think that's the really interesting texture and richness of history, why we need to dig into these stories.
All right, Ryan, we just go for a quick break and then we come back. Obviously, we continue this talk. هموطنان عزیز، بینندگان محترم، با ما باشید. همچنان با راین هستیم. انشالله در رابطه با خیلی موضوعات دیگه میشه صحبت خواهم کنیم. با ما باشید. Thank you very much, Ryan, for your time. And let's talk about one of the articles that obviously you was also interviewed and I was also interviewed on that in ABC. You're talking about a very well-known Australian author who actually went to Berks, I think. You can correct me if I'm wrong. Yeah. And I think it was Henry Lawson, right? And then you're talking about he was there, but somehow he didn't tell the story of Afghans. Please give us a bit more. Who was Lawson, and how was this story and was unveiled there?
So Henry Lawson is recognised as probably one of Australia's most popular writers, most famous writers. He wrote poetry, and he wrote short sketches, and he was famous for writing about the outback and for writing about regional Australia. He's credited with playing a large part in creating a national white identity. And he went to Burke in 1892. He went in September 1892. He spent 9 months in the area, and some of the poems and stories that he wrote there really cemented this reputation that he has as being one of the founding fathers of white Australian identity. I take issue with Henry Lawson because while he was in Burke, it was at the time when Abdul Wade was in Burke, when Gunny Khan was in Burke. There's a lot of Afghan men in Burke. And he mentions them very briefly. And when he does, it's in a negative way. He doesn't recognize their work. Now, why I think that's important is because Henry Lawson was embedded with the unions in Burke. He was a member of the unions. And that stage, the unions were in conflict with the Afghan camel drivers and the camel workers. And so he just took their view. But what he also did was say, well, the view of the white union workers is the view of all white people in Burke. And that's also incorrect, because there are a lot of men, and there's a lot of letters and a lot of evidence and a lot of women in Burke, and I'll come back to why the women as well, who supported the Afghans and wanted them to stay. And so when the union started creating petitions and lobbying the New South Wales Parliament to pass laws to ban the Afghans, a lot of people, I'll say the majority of people in Burke, came out in support and said, no, hang on, these men, they're sober, they deliver on time. Because you have to remember that this part of Australia, and I'm not sure if your viewers are familiar with this part of Australia, but it's a part of Australia that is very much exposed to climatic conditions, drought and flood. And so if you're living out in these areas in 1890, you depend on transport to get your supplies. And when it floods, the white transport workers couldn't get through because they were using bullocks, horses with wagons, and they just get bogged. In drought, it became too costly to feed the animals thing. So in floods and droughts, which are the two constants of outback life, the camels could travel in flood and they could travel in drought. So they became very reliable people to deal with. So you'd be receiving your supplies for your station from them. Then when you had your wool, which is your income, to go to market, it was the Afghans that were taking it, and they were taking it on time. So Henry Lawson didn't mention any of these white voices in support of the Afghans. He didn't mention the good work that they were doing. But what's also interesting is that the attributes or characteristics that he gave to the white Australians that become embedded into how we think of ourselves as Australian, mateship, egalitarianism, ingenuity, I argue that the Afghan men had all of those qualities. And if you look at how they supported the community, they donated food to the community, they donated charity in the communities, they provided work for people. So women came out in support of them, because the Afghan men, obviously they hadn't brought women from Afghanistan, so they would employ local women to make their clothes for them. Obviously they weren't buying clothes from the local store because they were dressing in traditional Afghan clothing. So they'd employ local women to sew and to make their clothes for them, and they would pay them, and they pay them fairly, and that's noted in the papers. So a lot of people were in support of these people. Henry Lawson omitted all that because he was going out there to prove a point, I suppose, to confirm his, rather than do journalism, he was going out there to confirm his thoughts on the superiority of white people. And he completely wrote that out of our history. I think that's a real shame. And I think for me personally, as a white Australian, although I'm from migrant family, Italians, but growing up in that area, I just feel I've missed out on knowing about, I'd love to know more about your culture, Fahim. I'd love to be able to talk to you and say, yeah, I know about this, and I know, and we lost all that. And I read all these old newspaper articles, and these Afghan men were very sharing, and they were putting on festivals, and they were entertaining the local people. They were sharing food. And I just think we miss out on so much of that because Henry Lawson omitted it and didn't talk about it. So it became kind of written out of history.
Sometimes I'm thinking, Ryan, if people were writing book or writing on the history of Afghan Cameleers, say from the time when the Cameleers was here, or let's say from 1930s onward, we may have a different story from Afghan Cameleers now, because we could see and we could feel and we could be with them and tell their stories. But unfortunately, their story was so been hidden somewhere until 1978 or 76, that the first published book was coming out. Am I correct on that?
I understand the first books came out in 1986 and 1987, which was the seminal book was Tin Mosques and Gun Towns. I think that was 86 or 87. But you're correct. If they had been written from the start, it would have been passed on, and those men would have had that recognition. And it's not just the men that I've been writing about. And this week is the 150-year anniversary of the Overland Telegraph. And the Overland Telegraph was the line that connected Australia to London in terms of communication. And it's considered the Australia's greatest engineering feat. So there's been a lot of articles in the newspapers this week about that. Not a mention of the Afghan men and the camels that worked on that project. Yeah. It would have been impossible to have completed that project in the time that was completed, if not. So they're not recognised at that time. And now 150 years later, in the most recent articles, even though we know they're involved, it's still not recognized. And it's quite interesting. If you go onto the internet and you look at the Wikipedia page for the Afghan Cameleers, it states their involvement in the Overland Telegraph. Go to the Overland Telegraph Wikipedia page, nothing, doesn't mention it. So those omissions that Henry Lawson started with, and other journalists who came along afterwards, they permeate through history. And if we don't start to tell these stories in another 100 years, we're still not going to know about it. And
Exactly.
people ask me, why is this important? And I met with a young Afghan Australian a week ago, and he said that after reading the book, he really felt more of a part of Australia because men like him had come here and contributed to the Australia that he was now living in. And he said before that, he felt that he'd been taught that Australia was built by white people. And so what connection did he have to this country? So I just thought by writing that book and recognize the work of that man, if that helps other Afghan people say, actually, we have a claim to the history of this country. We've contributed as Afghan people. We've contributed to this country. So that's why I think it's important to recognize that work, and why I'm a little bit upset with that Henry Lawson didn't recognize it all those years ago.
And that's why you started your book with his obviously quote and all the story of how he dealt with the situation then.
Yeah, correct. So Henry Lawson has a very famous quote, which is, "If you know Burke, you know Australia."
Yeah.
And I think he's correct. I don't think he knew Burke, but
Yeah.
I think he's correct, because if you go back to Burke today, Burke, it's a very remote community, but it's very multicultural. And there are people there from all over the world working, and there were people there from all over the world working in 1890. There were Norwegians, there were Swedish, there were Spanish, there were Germans, there were Afghans, men from the Punjab, men from Baluchistan. But he gave us this image of this white town.
Well, that image is obviously everywhere, and the fact is that still that sort of image is going on. That is a little bit shocking. As you mentioned before, rightly, that Overland Telegraph line anniversary was 150 just today, yesterday, or the day before. But even I saw a article on ABC News, they didn't mention it. So I don't know what sort of why that kind of approach still get carried on, and why I have no idea. And I hope your book says.
Well, I think, Fahim, that people don't know, because like I said, if that person writing that newspaper article, now I hope they go to more than Wikipedia, but if they go to Wikipedia, there's no mention of Afghans. You have to search to find these mentions because they weren't written at the time. So what I'm hopeful is that this book, and I'm seeing that people want to know. When I talk to people, I gave a talk in my hometown yesterday, probably 25 people, and there was genuine interest, there was genuine regret, and these were people sort of over the age of 50. They didn't know about it, but there was actually a genuine interest to know. And I think maybe 10 years ago, well, that was history, who cares, we don't want to know about it. I think people now want to know and feel that it's important to know. So the fact that I was able to find a publisher for this book shows that there's a market, that people want to read about these stories. A lot of Australian history, if you go to the bookshops, it's about white men still. And you look and there's all these white faces staring out from the covers. And so I'm so proud to go into a bookstore now and see a picture of Abdul Wade standing next to a camel on the new release section, because I think Australia needs that. And I hope it contributes something to the Australian Afghan community, but I know it's contributing to the knowledge of white Australians and trying to create that space for stories for men like Abdul.
Yeah, it's exactly. And I'm so glad that you went so details on one character of this whole story. I mean, when we talk about Afghan Cameleers, is a general kind of stories, and so far books normally actually emphasizing so much on the matter of who they were, where they came from, which religion. But your book is actually about one character, and that character is very important character. We know that he was involved with the building of the Adelaide Mosque, which is the first Australian mosque built and still running. I think that character is very important character, Ryan.
Oh, he's extremely important character. And what amazed me when I started researching Fahim was how many times he's mentioned in the newspapers. He's everywhere. So this guy's an important person, not in the Afghan community, not an important person in the migrant community, an important person in the whole country. And it wasn't a country at that stage, it was different colonies. But the amount of places he turned up, he's in Port Pirie, then he's in Cairns, then he's in Perth. He's just doing an amazing amount of travel. And somebody said to me the other day, oh, it's an amazing book. And I said, well, I just wrote his story. It's an amazing book because he lived an amazing life.
Exactly.
And so,
yeah.
I just feel very proud that I get to tell that story. And I ummed and ahed about whether I should tell it. But then I thought, well, I want to tell it because I was amazed reading it, learning about him. And I wanted to share that excitement. And my hope is there's a lot untold about his story, what happened in Afghanistan. So I want, hopefully my book's just a starting point and someone else can come along and really tell the full story of Abdul Wade, his descendants, tell the story of his business partners. There's some fascinating characters. Also, there's another man in Burke called Bai Khan, and he'd fought in the Afghan Anglo Wars, and then he ended up living to 107 in Burke. Now, imagine the stories he's got. So I hope this is just a starting point.
Exactly. Very interesting name for the book, Ballad of Abdul Wade. Am I pronouncing correct? Ballad, right? And if it's ballad, the ballad. And what is that meaning? Because when we're searching on Afghan or English to Persian to translate it to us, it says romantic or romance or what do you call love story of Abdul Wade. Is that correct translation?
Well, I did become a bit obsessed with his story, but for us, a ballad could be like a long poem as such that Henry Lawson would write. Or a story, or it's like a folkloric story. It could be a song, it could be a poem, it could be a story. It's a ballad. There's a bit of nostalgia to it. But the reason I chose that title is because from my research, I believe that Abdul Wade felt himself to be an Australian. And I felt we have this folkloric tradition that he was left out of. So it was kind of my attempt to place him back into Australian folklore. And what better way than to have his own ballad?
Oh, excellent. Very different translation, obviously.
Well, yeah. I mean, today, like in pop music or rock music, a ballad is like a love song, like a big ballad, maybe something that Meatloaf would sing. But it's also has a different terminology in literature. And that's where I was trying to place Abdul's story back into Australian, the history of Australian literature and that tradition of ballads in country Australia and regional Australia. Because I think even when he became really rich and famous and he had a large house in Sydney, he still lived out at Burke. He was very much of the outback, and I think he loved that red dirt out there. And so I wanted to return him to his place in history, where I think, and again, I'll apologize to him if that's not what he wanted, but he came here when he was 16, and in all his letters he says, I'm the first, I consider myself Australian, my family's Australian, so I'm sure he always felt Afghan, but I just wanted to honor him or recognize him in Australian literature history.
Oh yeah, excellent, because we know a lot of stories about Abdul Wade. Number one, he was always dressing like Australian people, whereas other Afghans was normally dressing their own kind of traditional costume. And also we have stories of Abdul Wade who contributed some camels to the World War, I think, One. Give us a bit more information on that, please.
So in 1913, he tried to get his son into the Australian Officers College at Duntroon, the Royal Military College at Duntroon, Abdul Hamid, and he was only about 11 or 12 years old at the time. So Abdul Wade, being the influential person he was, he wrote directly to the Minister of Defence and said, hey, I want to enrol my son. The Minister of Defence wrote to Duntroon and they said, he's eligible, but we don't want anyone with Asian blood in the officers. So his son was rejected, and that really hit hard for Abdul. I think that really affected him. Then a year later, but this is the mark of the man and his character, a year later when war broke out, he was the first person to say, whatever Australia needs, if you need men, if you need my camels, I can donate 500 camels to the war effort. 500 camels. 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 And this is one of the other funny things in history. It's always recorded as the offer was never accepted. And they use that to show that Abdul wasn't accepted. But it's not true. The offer was accepted. They didn't take 500 camels because it would have been impractical to send the 500 camels to the Middle East when they could get the camels over there. But they did accept 6 of the camels for training purposes. And they were crucial because at that time, the Australian Army had the Imperial Camel Corps, and that was used to fight in the Middle East and North Africa. The problem was, because white people in Australia had refused to work with camels for the past 20 years, nobody knew what to do with the camels. So they were trying to train the men before they deployed overseas, and they were using 2 camels from the Sydney Zoo. So 2 camels to try and train all these men. Abdul Wade donated, that we know of, 6 camels, which was accepted, and he sent them down to Bourke from Bourke at his own cost down to Sydney, and they were used to train and get those Australian soldiers familiar with the camels and how to use them. So you can imagine what a great assistance that was. He also offered to donate camels in 1899 when the Boer War in South Africa started as well.
Right. And also the fact that he was wearing costume of, Australian kind of clothes, or Australian kind of, gentleman, always not having his own kind of traditional. What was that coming from, you think? That's the first page of your book, by the way.
Yeah, so he dressed, I suppose, to fit in. Now, did he feel obliged to fit in? Did he want to fit in? It's hard to know. He came here when he was 16, so it's very young. And you see, people that migrate at that age, they really adapt to the culture they come into. His English was excellent. All the reporters say he spoke excellent English. I think he considered himself an Australian, and I think he was trying to build an Australian family. He married a white girl who was born in Dublin. And so I think that was part of it. And I think he was an extremely gifted networker. I mean, you don't go into business with the people he went into business with if you're not. So I think he was a person who was able to blend in. What really fascinated me about him as a character is he was able to really walk in 2 worlds. And I'm sure every person who comes to a new, not just Australia, any person who goes to a new country, you've got your culture and your ways, and then you've got where you've gone to. And it's a lot of trade-offs. How do you manage that? What do you keep from your country? What do you choose to let go? What do you choose to adopt to? What do you choose to adapt? I think it's a constant negotiation. And I think that he was so successful in Australia shows that he was very skilled at walking between those 2 worlds. So, he was able to sit down and negotiate the contracts with the men from Baluchistan and the Punjab and other Afghans. But he was also going to the High Court and the Supreme Court and suing people. So he was able to sit down with the mullah, I don't know if that's the correct pronunciation, but the priest from the mosque in Adelaide, and mullah. He was able to sit down with the mullah and settle conflicts. But then he was also in the Supreme Court suing people. But he's very adept, and he had these high class lawyers with him, so he knew how to use the systems. He knew how to walk between 2 worlds. And I think that's an amazing example of someone who never let go of his Afghan identity, but he also created an identity that he seemed to be very comfortable with here in Australia and was accepted, despite what the modern history will tell us. He was very much accepted here and was very, very successful.
Excellent. I think we are almost 50 minutes now, Ryan.
I've enjoyed our chat.
Just wondering to know about the family of Abdul Wade. How did he end up, obviously, going back to Afghanistan? Not how many children here, wife, and please.
So he married Emily Murcutt, that was her second marriage. She'd been married to an Indian man previously, a condiment maker. She married Abdul Wade in 1895 in Perth. They had 7 children. Unfortunately, 1 died early as a baby, but 6 adults, 4 women and 2 men. The end of Abdul Wade's story, it's a mystery, and maybe that's something that one of your viewers can take up the challenge to find out, what happened to him in the end. He leaves Australia in 1923. He heads off. His wife stayed, Emily. She died in 1926. We have a few sightings of Abdul. It was in the Northwest Frontier Province, crossing the border. He turned up at the construction of the Khyber Pass Railway. And then one of the last sightings we have of him is in London, and he's having dinner at the Savoy Hotel and that's recorded in the memoir of one of the directors of BHP. And he was on his way to France. He was in London applying for a visa on his way to France. Now, it's kind of mysterious. I'd love to know what happens to him, but that's what we know. He probably the last mention of him is his son was in Afghanistan, Osman. And there's a newspaper clipping from around, I think it's about 1928, where Osman's evacuated from Kabul. And it says that he's evacuated from Kabul and his father was the famous camel owner in Australia. And Osman is evacuated to Peshawar, where he's been reunited with his father. But I don't have any other evidence of that. And a lot of the information in the newspapers of the day was completely wrong. So
Completely
I'm
wrong.
sure, completely wrong. So whether he was in Peshawar, I'm not sure. But my feeling is this, and it's one of my great regrets that I couldn't do any research in Afghanistan. I don't speak any of the languages. I reached out to a few different universities and history departments. I couldn't get any response. But I would love that someone over there must know that Osman must have had children maybe. There must be descendants of Abdul Wade over there. And he was such a charismatic figure. I'm sure he left an impression. And there must be some record of the time that he spent in Afghanistan.
I think, Ryan, you should watch my next documentary, which is all about Afghan Cameleers and history of Abdul Wade. And we track down his children in Afghanistan. So obviously there are lots of other things to prove in that, but we've been in contact with them, and that's going to be fascinating, I think, for all of us to know the connection back in Afghanistan.
Well, that's great news, Fahim. And I watched your first documentary, and that was great. That was informative, and I feel if I've contributed a little bit, and now you and other people can go on and tell those stories, and it's fascinating. It's a fascinating piece of Australian history. And I hope it's a fascinating piece of Afghan history. It's something that binds the two countries. And I think we've had so many things that haven't bound us as countries. And wouldn't it be lovely if in 5 years' time, two people, one from Afghanistan, one from Australia, can meet and talk about this shared history that we have? And wouldn't that be a lovely thing to discuss and have something in common? And it's there. We have it. We just have to use it and acknowledge it.
Exactly. What is your message? I mean, to just finish this interview, what is your message? What do you want to tell to Australian and to Afghans?
What I would tell to Australian people is that it's time to make space for these other histories of people that came to Australia and contributed to Australia. It doesn't detract anything from the history of white Australia. It adds to it. It recognizes that Australia was always multicultural, always relied on people with different backgrounds, different cultures, people that spoke differently, looked differently, people that prayed differently. And it's time that we created a space where we can discuss that and acknowledge it. It doesn't erase what white people have done in Australia. It adds to the history of the country. For Afghans, I don't know how it's seen. They must know that some of their men went to Australia in the 1890s, and I would hope that they would read the story of Abdul Wade and feel proud of him. He lived an amazing life, and in some way, hopefully, he's an example that you can go out, and if you do go to another country, if you choose to go to another country, if you don't choose, that you can make a life for yourself. And Abdul Wade showed that it's possible. And he was such an important figure in Australia at the time, and it's recognized at the time. And I think if I was Afghan, I think I'd be very proud to know that a compatriot had done what Abdul Wade did in really difficult circumstances.
Oh, thank you very much, Ryan. I mean, it's very important to hear stories of Afghan Cameleers from people like you. As you said, or as you mentioned a couple of times, we read a lot of books, articles. Normally, negative parts are so highlighted for some reason or others, which we never understood why. But talking with you is so fascinating that the other face or other side of the Afghan Cameleers being portrayed in your book, which is amazing. It is, I think, the first time being written this way, and I think it's very important and very valuable to our people, and I hope our viewers, whoever is watching us, to read the book of Ryan. It's the Ballad of Abdul Wade. Thank you very much, Ryan.
Thanks very much for having me, Fahim. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate your kind words and all the work you do for the Afghan Australian community as well.
Thank you very much.